They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but in the sweltering heat of a maximum security prison, I learned it's a dish you prepare for years, meticulously, right under the noses of the men who think you're nothing. They saw a girl, a joke in a uniform too big for her, but they never once saw the ghost that walked the halls of Blackgate Penitentiary, hunting the man who had stolen her life. This is the story of how I, the invisible officer everyone laughed at, dismantled a corrupt empire with a single silent move and made its king, a powerful and untouchable warden, tremble for his very soul. Before I continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, and leave your like. It helps a lot. My name is Evelyn Reed, and on the day I first set foot inside Blackgate, I was, for all intents and purposes, already dead to the world. At 24 years old, with a slender build that the coarse fabric of my uniform swallowed whole, I was the antithesis of everything this place represented. Blackgate wasn't just a prison, it was a sprawling, brutalist monument to human misery, a self-contained city housing 3,000 of the state's most hardened men. It breathed with its own foul ecosystem, thrived on its own savage culture, and bowed to its own absolute monarch. That king wasn't a politician or a bureaucrat. His name was Warden Marcus Thorne, and his throne was built on secrets and bone. The moment I walked the line on C Block, I became a caricature. The air, thick with the smell of sweat, disinfectant, and despair, seemed to part around me, making way for the punchline. The inmates christened me before I even learned their names. Goldilocks, a hulking lifer with dead eyes, sneered during my first morning count. Officer Princess, another one called out, followed by a chorus of mocking whistles. My posture was too straight, a ruler-straight line of tension in a world of predatory slouches. My voice, when I called out inmate numbers, was too clear, too clean, lacking the gravelly edge of authority that came from years of screaming over riots. I was an anomaly, and in Blackgate, anomalies were either crushed or consumed. My fellow officers offered no sanctuary. They saw my meticulous by-the-book approach as a fatal flaw, a sign of crippling naivety. While other guards handled infractions with a rough shove and a string of curses, I wrote detailed, multi-page reports citing specific institutional codes. During our 15-minute breaks, while they gathered in the smoke-filled lounge, swapping war stories and laughing about inmate brawls, I would find a quiet corner, my face buried in dense policy manuals, searching for loopholes in the fortress walls. Sergeant Reynolds, a veteran whose gut strained the buttons of his shirt like a captive animal, pulled me aside during my first week. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, its weight a heavy, paternalistic warning. "Kid, you're gonna get eaten alive," he grumbled, his breath sour with stale coffee. "You think these animals care about Regulation 4.15 subsection B? They care about who can make 'em bleed. And honey, that sure as heck ain't you." The room erupted in laughter, sealing my fate. I was the office joke, a walking, talking rulebook in a place governed by unwritten, bloody laws. But they all made the same critical mistake. They saw a lamb, and they had no idea I was a wolf in sheep's clothing. They confused my quietness for timidity and my constant observation for fear. They had absolutely no idea that I saw everything, because I was looking for something they couldn't even imagine. Section 1. The Invisible Woman. I didn't choose a career in corrections for the pension or the illusion of power. For me, this was a pilgrimage into the heart of the beast that had devoured my life. My father was a forensic accountant, a quiet genius who found symphonies of crime hidden in the silent, endless columns of spreadsheets. He taught me to see the world not as a collection of people and places, but as a series of interconnected systems. He taught me to look for the patterns, the tiny, almost invisible discrepancies that scream the truth when no one else is listening. And Blackgate was the most complex, broken system he had ever encountered. My father knew it better than anyone. He died here. That is the part one never told a soul. Warden Thorne didn't just run this prison. He had orchestrated my father's downfall. He had used his vast, shadowy network to pin a massive embezzlement scheme on him, a scheme my father was in the process of uncovering. My dad, the most honest and meticulous man I had ever known, was sentenced to 20 years in the very institution Thorne commanded. He lasted 2. The official report called it a random act of inmate violence during a yard scuffle. But I knew better. My father had gotten too close to the truth from the inside, and Thorne, with a single, untraceable order, had him silenced. So, I came to Blackgate. I inherited his analytical mind and his unshakable resolve. I came not just to understand the system that killed him, but to become the ghost in the machine that would burn it to the ground. My first few months were a masterclass in calculated humiliation, a role I had to play with excruciating perfection. I had to become what they all expected me to be: weak, scared, and utterly incompetent. During morning count, inmates would deliberately garble my name, turning Reed into Reeds-a-lot or Weed, sparking ripples of laughter down the cell block. They would spill entire trays of slop just as I walked by, then offer these syrupy, fake apologies that dripped with sarcasm. One afternoon, a powerful inmate named Rico, the undisputed king of C-Block, stared me down while I wrote him up for contraband, a beautifully carved, handmade chess set. He just leaned against the bars of his cell, a gold tooth flashing in the dim, grimy light, and smiled. "You keep writing with that little pen of yours, Goldilocks. You just keep on writing. Let me know how that works out for you." The next day, the digital incident report had vanished from the system entirely, as if it had never existed, and Rico was in the yard, casually playing chess with his new set. The message was unambiguous, a clear demonstration of the prison's real power structure. The other guards reinforced it daily. "Some things you just learn not to see," another officer, Diaz, told me quietly after the incident, trying to offer what he thought was helpful advice. "It's easier that way. Keeps the peace." He thought he was helping me survive. I just nodded, playing the part of the naive rookie who was slowly learning her lesson. But I couldn't not see. It was my entire reason for being there. While they saw a joke, my mind was a high-speed processor, a sponge soaking up every single detail they dismissed as background noise. I saw the imperceptible nod from a guard in the tower to an inmate leader in the yard just before a contraband drop. I logged the delivery schedules of a single janitorial supply company, Tri-State Cleaners, which was arriving 3 times a week, an absurd frequency for a prison of this size, a glaring anomaly that no one else had ever questioned. I spent my nights cross-referencing commissary accounts, noticing that certain inmates with no external funds were suddenly wearing brand-new sneakers and trading expensive cigarettes. These weren't violent acts. They were discrepancies. They were tiny, almost invisible threads sticking out of what was supposed to be a seamless, impenetrable wall of authority. And at the heart of this sprawling web, like a bloated, silent spider, sat Warden Marcus Thorne. To the public, he was a charismatic reformer who gave eloquent speeches to the press about second chances and meaningful rehabilitation. His words were beautiful, hollow vessels, utterly meaningless within his own walls. Inside Blackgate, Thorne was a phantom. He never walked the cell blocks. His power wasn't projected through presence or leadership, but through a chilling, untouchable aura of absolute authority. Thorne's real deputies weren't his captains. They were the inmate shot-callers like Rico, who enforced a brutal peace on the blocks in exchange for certain privileges. As long as there were no riots and no escapes for the 6 o'clock news, Thorne was praised for running a stable facility. I knew his system was built on a sophisticated network of corruption. It was an open secret that contraband wasn't just slipping in, it was flowing through a managed pipeline. Guards were on a payroll to look the other way, to lose inconvenient reports, to leave specific cells unlocked for a few critical minutes at night. This system pacified the most powerful inmates, which in turn suppressed the overall violence that would attract outside scrutiny. It was a house of cards built on bribes and fear, and Warden Thorne sat at the very top, completely insulated. Everyone knew it, but no one could prove it. Proving it meant taking on not just a handful of powerful inmates, but the entire command structure and the man who held all their leashes. For a CO, especially one they all saw as a joke, it was a death sentence. But I wasn't just a CO. I was a daughter seeking justice. And one rainy Tuesday, during a routine cell inspection that was anything but routine for me, I found it, the first tangible thread I could actually pull. It was almost nothing. Tucked inside a hollowed-out history book in the cell of a low-level, unassuming inmate, I found a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a weapon or drugs. It was a receipt. A commissary receipt, but not from our prison. It was from an external gourmet vendor, for items like steak, shrimp, and aged cheeses, delicacies no one had seen in the Blackgate mess hall for decades. And at the bottom, scrawled in faint, hurried pencil, were 2 words that made my blood run cold and my breath catch in my throat: Thorne's table. Any other guard would have laughed and tossed it as some inmate's fantasy. But I saw it for what it was, a crack in the fortress wall. It was the first piece of physical evidence that connected the low-level corruption on the block to the man in the warden's chair. It confirmed what my father had died trying to prove. I folded the receipt, my hands trembling slightly, and slipped it deep into my pocket. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of real, dangerous hope. The joke was over. My father's investigation had just begun. Section 2. Connecting the dots. I knew I was walking through a minefield with every step I took inside that prison. It was just me against a deeply entrenched system of corruption that benefited everyone from the lowest-ranking inmate to the warden himself. I couldn't go to my superiors. They were either complicit or willfully blind. I couldn't trust my fellow officers. They'd already branded me as a liability they'd be happy to be rid of. I had to operate from the shadows, weaponizing the very thing they all mocked me for, my obsessive, relentless attention to detail. My true work began under the convenient cover of their ridicule. I started collecting data, mountains of it, transforming my small, sterile apartment into an intelligence operations hub. I cross-referenced commissary logs with guard patrol schedules and overtime sheets. I spent my evenings not resting, but hunched over a laptop, my eyes burning as I dug through public records of every vendor contracted with the prison for the last decade. My apartment slowly transformed. I pinned a schematic of the prison to one wall, using different colored strings to map inmate hierarchies and guard loyalties. On another wall, I started a complex diagram of names and connections, a sprawling web of corruption, just like the ones my father used to make when he was tracking dirty money for the feds. It was a bittersweet tribute, a painful continuation of his life's work. My first major breakthrough came from those suspicious janitorial supplies. The deliveries from Tri-State Cleaners were always signed off by the same two guards, a man named Henderson and another named Clark, no matter whose shift it was supposed to be. I spent weeks of my own money on background checks and corporate record searches, my savings dwindling with every query. I finally found it. Tri-State was a shell corporation, registered to a post office box, and its listed owner was a man who had been dead for 3 years. The company wasn't delivering pallets of bleach and floor wax. It was the primary pipeline for the drugs, cell phones, and other high-value contraband that kept Thorne's brutal peace intact. This confirmed the how of the operation, but not the definitive link to the man at the very top. The Thorne's table receipt was my only direct link to the warden, and on its own, it was flimsy, circumstantial. I needed to follow the money. A corrupt system of this magnitude, as my father always taught me, always leaves a financial trail. I started observing Henderson and Clark, the two guards who signed for the ghost deliveries. On paper, they lived modest lives. They drove old cars and lived in small, suburban homes. But I noticed they were both heavily involved in the prison's underground gambling pool on professional sports, and they always paid their significant losses in cash, with crisp, $100 bills that a CO's salary could never explain. They were being paid well for their silence and signatures. The risk I was taking was escalating with every piece of information I gathered. I felt a constant prickle on the back of my neck, the suffocating feeling of being watched. My paranoia grew. Was the quiet click on my phone line just my imagination? Was the car parked across from my apartment every night just a coincidence? During one shakedown, as I was methodically searching a cell, Rico, the C-Block boss, walked slowly past me in the hall. "Be careful what you're looking for, Goldilocks," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest, without even breaking stride. "Sometimes you find it." The threat wasn't loud, but it was suffocatingly clear. They were watching me. They were noticing the quiet girl was a little too quiet, a little too observant. My act was beginning to wear thin. If you're still here with me, don't forget to subscribe, activate notifications, leave your like, and share this video with someone. I knew my quiet digging would eventually bubble up to someone who could crush me without a second thought. I needed an ace in the hole, evidence so undeniable, so concrete, that it couldn't be buried or erased. I had to turn my attention to the heart of the entire operation, the warden's office. I couldn't just walk in there. But I knew the annual State Oversight Committee audit was approaching. These audits were usually a complete farce. The warden would get a heads-up weeks in advance, giving him plenty of time to cook the books and prepare a sanitized presentation of the facility. The auditors would check the pristine official records, talk to a few hand-picked, compliant inmates, and inevitably give Blackgate a passing grade. It was all a well-rehearsed play. But I suspected Thorne's real records, the ones detailing the entire criminal enterprise, weren't on any official state server. A man as careful and paranoid as him wouldn't be that sloppy. He'd have a separate ledger, something entirely offline, under his absolute personal control. The challenge was finding it, and then getting it into the hands of the auditors without them realizing it was being handed to them. A direct tip from a low-level, disliked officer like me? They would laugh it off, and I'd be lucky to get a transfer. More likely, I'd have a tragic accident before my paperwork cleared. I began meticulously studying Thorne's daily routine. He arrived at 7 a.m. sharp and spent the first hour locked in his office alone. I started making conversation with an older administrative assistant named Carol, a woman who had been there for 30 years and was invisible in her own way. I was always polite, brought her coffee sometimes, and listened to her stories about the old days. She liked me. She told me the warden was fiercely, almost pathologically, protective of his personal office computer. It was a high-end, custom-built machine, far more powerful than the standard state desktops, and it was strictly off-limits to the prison's IT staff. Thorne claimed he used it for personal correspondence and writing a memoir. That was it. That was my father's Rosetta Stone. Thorne's entire criminal empire, the kickbacks from Tri-State, the contraband schedules, the money laundering, the evidence of what really happened to my father, it had to be on that machine. And it was isolated, probably heavily encrypted, and protected by the warden's absolute authority. I felt a dizzying surge of adrenaline mixed with sheer terror. I now knew the what and the where. The only question was how. How could I, the invisible girl, get that computer into the hands of investigators without Thorne or anyone else knowing I was involved? I needed a plan that was quiet, precise, and used the system's own crushing bureaucracy against itself. And then, during a mandatory inventory check in the prison's dusty, forgotten basement, I found my weapon. It was simple, elegant, and relied on the one thing everyone in a state job, including Warden Thorne, both relied on and hated: bureaucracy. In a dark corner, piled among broken chairs and old, humming monitors, was a stack of old computer towers waiting to be hauled away as e-waste. And on the side of each one was a small, metallic sticker, a state asset tag. These tags were the lifeblood of the state's inventory system. Every single piece of state property, from a stapler to a transport van, had a unique tag. During an audit, inspectors scanned these tags to ensure every piece of property was accounted for. I looked at the tag on a worthless, decade-old desktop. Then I pictured the sleek, powerful custom tower humming quietly under Warden Thorne's mahogany desk. A plan began to crystallize in my mind, a plan so audacious and yet so beautifully simple it made my heart pound against my ribs. I wouldn't have to steal the computer. I wouldn't have to hack it. I would simply relabel it. I would use the state's own rigid, unthinking system to make it see the warden's fortress of secrets as a worthless piece of forgotten junk. I now had my weapon. The audit was 3 weeks away. I had one chance to get into the warden's office, alone, for less than a minute. The laughingstock of Blackgate was about to set a trap for the king. Section 3. The Ghost's Gambit. The 2 weeks leading up to the audit were the most agonizing of my life. Every day was a tightrope walk over a canyon of failure, and the wind was picking up. My plan was set, a delicate sequence of bureaucratic maneuvers, but the execution had to be flawless. I needed a legitimate reason to be near the warden's administrative wing, a carpeted, quiet world utterly forbidden to line officers like me. And more importantly, I needed a moment of pure, unadulterated chaos just long enough to pull off my silent, administrative coup. I found my potential distraction in the prison's ancient, notoriously faulty fire alarm system. I had spent hours poring over years of maintenance reports I'd gotten access to by befriending one of the junior maintenance workers. The system in the admin wing was famous for false alarms caused by everything from dust to humidity. The protocol for any alarm, false or not, was rigid and absolute: immediate and total evacuation. Even Warden Marcus Thorne had to follow the procedure and stand outside with everyone else. My plan was terrifyingly simple. I would trigger a false alarm myself. I studied the building schematics I had managed to photograph with my phone and found a smoke sensor in a small janitor's closet right down the hall from Thorne's office. The risk was monumental. If I got caught, I wouldn't just be fired. I'd be facing felony charges for triggering a false alarm in a maximum security facility. My life would be over. But it was the only way. This was for my father. The day of the audit finally arrived. The air in the prison was thick with a false, manufactured sense of calm. The State Oversight Committee was scheduled to arrive at 10 a.m. At 9:45 a.m., I took a long, steadying breath that did nothing to calm the frantic hummingbird wings of my heart. I had managed to swap my patrol duty with another officer, telling him I had a blinding migraine and needed a less strenuous post for a few hours. He'd laughed, called me soft, and eagerly agreed. Perfect. I made my way to the admin building's second floor, my footsteps silent on the carpet. In my pocket, my fingers nervously traced the outline of the asset tag I had so carefully peeled from the junked computer in the basement. I slipped into the janitor's closet, the smell of old bleach and dust filling my nostrils, a smell of mundane utility that contrasted sharply with the gravity of my actions. I pulled out a small pocket-sized can of compressed air, the kind used for cleaning keyboards. My hand was shaking so violently I had to grip it with my other hand. I held it up and aimed it directly at the vents of the smoke detector on the ceiling. I pressed the nozzle. For 1, 2, 3 terrifying seconds, nothing happened. A cold dread washed over me. Failure. Then, the piercing, deafening shriek of the fire alarm erupted, a wave of sound that vibrated through the floor. Doors flew open. Administrative staff spilled out into the hallway, their faces a mixture of annoyance and confusion. I stepped out of the closet and seamlessly blended into the stream of people heading for the emergency exits. Through the crowd, I saw Warden Thorn emerge from his office, his face a mask of pure irritation. He turned to lock his office door, the key already in the lock. This was my moment. "Sir," I called out, my voice cutting through the noise, shockingly steady and authoritative. "Warden, protocol states all doors must be left unlocked to allow access for the fire department." It was a complete and utter lie. But in the midst of the chaos, it sounded official, urgent, and correct. Thorn, a man obsessed with appearing in control, hesitated for only a fraction of a second. His eyes, accustomed to never being questioned, flickered with annoyance. He shot me an irritated glance, grunted, and pulled the key from the lock, leaving it dangling. He then hurried down the hall to join the other senior staff. The door was unlocked. I let the river of people flow past me, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I glanced down the now empty hallway, then back. No one was looking. I slipped inside the warden's office. The room was like another world. Plush carpeting, the scent of leather and wood polish, a wide window overlooking the manicured prison entrance, a sterile facade for the rot within. And there it was. Under the massive mahogany desk, the custom-built computer tower, humming silently. Its quiet power felt menacing. I dropped to my knees behind the desk, out of sight from the doorway. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely function, but my mind was a razor. I found the official state asset tag on the back of the machine. It took me 10 agonizing seconds to peel it off without tearing it, each second stretching into an eternity. I quickly stuck it to the inside of my belt. Then, I took out the tag from the junk computer, the one that marked it for disposal, and carefully, with trembling fingers, smoothed it into place on Thorn's machine. I stood up, took one last look around the room that held the secrets of my father's demise, and walked out, closing the door quietly behind me. I joined the evacuees outside just as the first fire truck arrived, its lights flashing, its purpose already rendered moot. 15 minutes later, the all-clear was given. It was declared a false alarm, blamed on a dusty sensor. An irritated Warden Thorn led the auditors back inside to resume their work. I watched them go before melting back into the concrete and steel world of C-Block. The trap was set. The cheese was on the spring. The audit proceeded exactly as Thorn had planned. The auditors reviewed his perfectly cooked books. Late in the afternoon, they began the final, tedious step, physical asset verification. A junior auditor, armed with a handheld barcode scanner, began moving methodically through the administrative offices. I was on patrol, but I could picture the scene as if I were standing in the room. The auditor enters Thorn's office. The warden, bored, overconfident, watches as the young man scans his desk, his chair, his filing cabinets. Then, the auditor bends down to scan the computer tower. The scanner beeps. The screen on his device, instead of displaying Warden's Office Custom PC, value, $4,500, reads, Surplus Desktop PC, Model 486. Status, decommissioned, pending disposal. There is a moment of profound, bureaucratic confusion. The tag number matches the entry on his master inventory list. According to the state's own infallible system, this incredibly powerful modern machine is a piece of junk slated for destruction. And per mandatory state procedure, any asset marked for disposal during an audit must be immediately confiscated for review and processing. No exceptions. Warden Thorn would protest. He would bluster and insist it was a clerical error, a ridiculous mistake. But the auditor, a young stickler for rules with his supervisor watching, would hold his ground. The tag is the tag. The system says what the system says. To refuse to hand over the machine would be to actively obstruct a state audit, a serious offense that would trigger a far more invasive, high-level investigation. Cornered by the very bureaucracy he so expertly manipulated, Thorn would have no choice. He would have to stand there, his face turning from a choleric red to a deathly ashen pale, as the auditor and a security escort unplugged his entire secret empire. His off-the-books ledgers, his contraband schedules, his bribe records, the truth of his crimes, and carried it out of his office in a cardboard box. He couldn't stop them without admitting exactly what secrets he was trying to protect. The aftermath wasn't a loud, dramatic explosion. It was a quiet, chilling implosion that echoed through the concrete halls of Blackgate. Warden Thorn made a series of frantic, furious calls to powerful people, but it was far too late. The computer was now state evidence, sealed and on its way to a forensic lab far beyond his reach or influence. That simple, silent swap of two small metallic stickers had irrevocably and completely sealed his fate. The news filtered back into the general population not as fact, but as a series of potent whispers. The warden was on indefinite administrative leave. Then, state investigators began swarming the prison, but this time they weren't on a guided tour. They were armed with names, dates, and account numbers. The data on Thorn's hard drive was the key that unlocked everything. The shell companies like Tri-State Cleaners, the offshore kickbacks, the hidden financial ties to inmate leaders, and the unvarnished truth behind dozens of unsolved incidents over the years, including the random death of a forensic accountant. It was all there, in pristine, undeniable detail. The power vacuum in the prison was immediate and brutal. The inmate shot callers like Rico, now stripped of their protection from the top, lost their authority overnight. Corrupt guards, sensing the ship was sinking, began turning on one another, desperately trying to cut deals with investigators. The entire house of cards that Thorn had so carefully constructed was collapsing in on itself. About a week later, I was walking the evening patrol on C Block when Sergeant Reynolds fell into step beside me. The usual gruffness was gone, replaced by a heavy quiet. "Your father was a good man," he said, not looking at me. "He was my partner, back when I was a detective. Before this." I stopped, my blood turning to ice. "I was with him on the Thorn investigation," he continued, his voice thick with a guilt that was decades old. "When Thorn framed him, I was told to back off or my family would get hurt. And I did. I folded. It's the biggest regret of my life." He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a pain I recognized. "When you showed up here, I saw him in you. That same fire. I tried to scare you away, to protect you in the only way I knew how. But you were too stubborn. Too much like him. So I did what I should have done years ago. I helped where I could. I thought back. The maintenance reports left on a desk. The patrol schedule that put me in the right place at the right time. The accidental power surge that erased the security footage in the admin hallway on the day of the audit. It was him. He was the other ghost. He hadn't saved me, but he had cleared the path." The final, cathartic scene of my long journey came a month later. Marcus Thorn, stripped of his title, his power, and facing a mountain of federal charges, had to return to Blackgate one last time to be processed. Escorted by 2 federal agents, he was a broken man, swallowed by a wrinkled suit, his face gray and hollowed out. As he was led shackled through the main corridor, he passed my post. I stood there, watching him, my expression unreadable. Thorn stopped. His eyes, once so commanding and dismissive, scanned my face. He looked at the young, quiet officer whose name he'd never bothered to learn. He looked at this Goldilocks, this joke, who had single-handedly and silently dismantled his life's work. And in that one, shattering moment, Thorn finally understood. He saw past the uniform, past the timid facade, and he saw the cold, calculating mind behind my calm eyes. He saw the ghost that had been haunting his prison. He saw the daughter of the man he had destroyed. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Thorne, the untouchable king of Blackgate, felt a tremor of pure, soul-deep fear. He wasn't just looking at a correctional officer. He was looking at the living embodiment of his sins. The warden trembled, not from the prison's chill, but from the horrifying realization that the jester he never even saw had not only stolen his crown but had come to collect a debt written in blood. My father was finally at peace. And for the first time, so was I. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, leave your like, and share this video with others.